Thank you. Hi, welcome everyone. I don't know why, but my talks tend to be just after lunch, so I hope no one fall asleep because I'm too boring. My name is Antonio Leiva. I'm an Android engineer at Plex, and I have a kind of second life where I try to learn to teach other Android engineers to start using Kotlin on their Android apps. But I don't want to tell much about it because I'll spoil you the rest of the talk with it, so it's not the moment. Today we are going to talk about Kotlin, how we can use Kotlin in different places in our Android apps. So I guess you already know that Google adopted Kotlin to develop Android apps. How many of you are already using Kotlin, or at least a lot? So this is really good because I'm not going deep into the little details of the language. I'm going to be more broad here, so it will be probably more interesting for you. And what I want to show you today is some other places apart from the one we can think of at the very beginning, which is to replace Java files. I want to tell you about some other things and what are the pros and cons where we can use Kotlin in our daily projects, like a final verdict of what I think, which is obviously not set into stone, but what I think, if I think it's mature enough to be used in production or not. So going too fast around all this, first I'll talk about how to use Kotlin instead of Java in our Android project. Then how to substitute Groovy in our Gradle files, and then also how to use it to create views, the UI of Android, instead of using XMLs. And finally, we'll talk about Kotlin everywhere. I'll just grab the surface, but I'll show you how the Kotlin ecosystem is evolving. First one. Kotlin instead of Java. This doesn't need much presentation, as you told me. Some of you are already using it in your projects. But you may also know that since Android 3.0, Kotlin is totally integrated into the IDE. We can just start a project in a matter of seconds with Kotlin integrated. And we'll see not the details about the language, but some examples on where Kotlin can help us in our day-to-day in our Android development. But well, the first thing what I was mentioning, that you can create Open Android Studio, and in Android Studio 3.0 we already have the option to include Kotlin in our Android projects, which is really easy. It already generates the first activity written in Kotlin and also configures the Gradle files for us, so it's pretty straightforward. And then what I wanted to show you was some examples on how we evolve from code written in Kotlin, but with Java style, to some more idiomatic Kotlin, as it's used to be called. What we see here is just a regular function that I took from a project that I have in GitHub that is called Banhood Kotlin, where you can, most of what I'm going to talk about today is taken from there, so you can go there and take a look at the code later. And this is just a regular function that is overriding the function of the parent class. If you see, the override in Kotlin is a reserved word, it's not an annotation. Some other differences for the ones that have not taken a look at Kotlin yet, the functions are written with the reserved word fun. Then the arguments and variables are defined the other way around, as we are using Java. Instead of writing the type and then the name, is the other way around. We first write the name and then the type. And also, we can define nullable types. In Kotlin, Kotlin is null safe, which means that if a type is declared as a nullable type, the compiler forces us to check the nullability before continuing. You cannot compile a project if there's a nullable, if we are trying to use a nullable type and we are not checking that it's not containing a null inside. And the rest is pretty similar to what we could be used in Java. It's an if-else, where if the detail is not null, it updates the album detail, and otherwise it postpones the transition of the activity until we have the content and we can show it in the screen. So how we could convert this to more idiomatic Kotlin? The first thing to say about this is that you shouldn't be obsessed about being writing perfect Kotlin from the very beginning, because this is a process and we have to learn. After 5 or 6 years, I keep learning things from Java almost every day, so we can imagine that Kotlin with so many extra features is even more difficult to master. So that's my first warning, that don't be obsessed about writing perfect Kotlin code, because I think that nobody knows still who is perfect Kotlin code. So it's a little bit of everyday discovery. But how would I change this code to something more idiomatic? Well, I will do something like this, for instance. You can, as we are receiving a nullable type, we have to check the type before calling the functions. So that way, if the object is null, we won't run this function. We are preventing the null pointer exception here. And we have then this other operator, which helps us do an alternative path in the case this is null. And then we have here a let function that what does basically is getting the object that is calling it, and then here we can use it like the first argument of the lambda we are passing to let. It's a very simple function, but we'll see that it can give us a little some little powers. In this case, we are going to focus on this lambda that can still be formatted a little bit more. We are writing the complete lambda, which means that we have the left side when we say how the input parameter of the lambda is going to be called, and then we use it on the right side of the lambda. This can be written in many different ways. For instance, we can have something like, this is not working. It works from time to time. Anyway, okay. This can be written like this, which means that we are using just the same name, but when we are using it here, Kotlin is doing what is called a markcast, which means that when we have checked some property of the type, for instance, we have checked here that this is not going to be null, this is markcasted here as a non-nullable type, and we can use it without any worries that this variable can be null here inside. But we can go beyond and use the reserved word IT, which means once more that when we have a lambda that only has one input parameter, we can substitute it with the reserved word IT. This is specific to lambdas that only receive one parameter. And there's another option still, which is the one I like the most, maybe because it's the one most exotic or the one that is more different to Java. That is calling the reference of the function. When we are calling a function just with the argument that the function is receiving, we can use directly the reference to the function, which is defined with these two columns. And then this is even a little more contracted. The rule of thumb is that if you are using a function inside the lambda that is only using the arguments of the lambda, we can just set the reference of the function and the the work is the same. It's working the same way because this function is conforming the lambda that this other function is expecting. Other things that we can do with Kotlin, as thanks to the way that Kotlin deals with lambdas, if we have as the last argument of a function, we have another function, we have a lambda, we can extract it out of the parentheses and use it like a block of code. That way we can create small DSLs to deal with our code. In this example, this suppose lollipop is receiving a lambda as a first argument, so we can extract it out of the parentheses and even remove it because it doesn't have any more arguments. And inside of the block of code, we can do things that only will be supported by lollipop devices. How this is done? In the end, the structure is very simple. It's just a regular function that receives another lambda as a function, which this lambda doesn't receive anything and doesn't return anything either. And we just need to set it inside an if block. If the version is greater or equals than 21, then we invoke the code. And then there is this special reserved word, which the inline, which what means is that when we are calling this function, instead of setting in bytecode level, instead of doing the real call to the function, what it's going to do is substitute the call with the body of the function. So if we see the bytecode that this has generated, we decompile the app, we'll see that in fact we don't have any references to this function. What we will see is this code inside. What is this helpful? Because as the point where we are calling this function already have all the context, we don't need to create an object to emulate a lambda. In general, if you want to use a lambda, the generated bytecode indeed will be an object that implements a function that has only one method. Implements a class that only has one method. We can skip this using the inline function, so the inline reserved word. So inline is very helpful to optimize functions that receive lambdas. And then another simple example to understand what we can do with Kotlin, and why I do think this is really helpful in the case of Android. In Android, in the framework, we have a lot of things that are very boilerplate, that we have to create a lot of difficult code to do simple things, and we can avoid all that thanks to extension functions. And extension functions is nothing more than a function that is applied to any class we specify, and it can even be function that we don't have access to the code. Let's see with an example. In this example, we are doing an animation, alpha, and then setting a listener so that when the animation is end, we do whatever we want. This is very typical that when we are doing an animation, the one that really matters is the on animation end. How we can convert this to a more readable code? Well, we could have an extension function like this, which is called on animation end, that receives a lambda, which is a well, it's called continuation because it will be called after the animation is called, but you can use whatever name you want here. And then this is doing the hard work. We had here a lot of information that we didn't need about, like creating the object, the animation listener adapter, then overriding the animation end. All that doesn't matter to us when we are reading our code. And to clean it up, we can create a function like this. Sorry, I spoiled you. A function like this that is creating the object, calling on animation, overriding on animation end, and then we do the real part of the work. The important part is this one. So when we use this function, the code will look something like this. We just have a new function so over the property animator that is called on animation end, and with the and just passing in the lambda what we want to do after that, we can have the same behavior we had before in a much readable way. Okay, so what's my verdict about using Kotlin instead of Java in our Android projects? This always depends a lot on the culture of the company and also on the teammates. These have to be evaluated deeply, but in terms of what we can do with it, I think there are no issues right now. We have the support of Google, we have all the language very well tested, and there are a lot of companies using it, and I think it's right now we hardly have any excuses, technically speaking, to start using Kotlin in our projects. Then, if you want to learn more about it, here's where I'm going to spoil you a little about my stuff. I have a book written that teaches you how to start learning Kotlin from scratch, and then also an online course that for you and this event it will be 25% off if you go to antonioleiva.com/event, and there you can also find the slides, all the links I'm showing during the talk. There's all the information about this talk, you can find it there too. And also, of course, the repository I talked you about, Banhood Kotlin, when all this is being used there. And then let's move to the next point, Kotlin for Gradle files. See, 1.5 years ago, more or less, Gradle unveiled that they were starting to support Kotlin to create Gradle files. Until now, they were only supporting Groovy, and since then, things have evolved quite a lot. So, like a month ago, I decided to give it another go, because at the beginning it was practically impossible to use. It was very difficult, and I want to show you here how was my experience and what I think about using nowadays in production. To write Gradle files in Kotlin, they had to kind of invent a new Kotlin version called Kotlin DSL, which is very similar to the regular Kotlin. For us, it won't have any differences. And one of the pros is that as Kotlin is a static language, as opposed to Groovy, that is a dynamic language, this means that the IDE can help us a lot during our development, when we are writing those files. Because, for instance, we have warnings, errors, when we are using something that is not valid, and even we have a good real autocomplete when we are writing our files too. So it becomes much more easier to write our Kotlin files than it was using Groovy, where you have to know all about the language and all about the structure of what we are using. Otherwise, it's very difficult to make it work properly. But it also has some cons. The first one is that it's not very easy to configure. You basically have to do it from scratch. At the moment, there is no autoconverter from Groovy to Kotlin. So you have to go little by little, trying stuff. And at the beginning, the IDE won't help you, because as nothing is compiling for the IDE, everything is broken since the beginning. So you cannot rely on it to keep writing your files. It's a bit obscure, the transition. Also, that you have to have some knowledge about the plugin structure. We'll see an example later, so I'm not going to stop here, because without the sample, it's very difficult to understand. But keep in mind that it's not so straightforward as Groovy, because we have to know how things are coded, so to be able to use it. And then there's not much documentation or examples. The official documentation is basically a repository with very simple examples that in real life are not extremely useful. And Not many people has tried yet either. If you look into GitHub, the examples are very simple too, and there are like 2 or 3 articles that you can follow to understand it a little more. So at this moment, the information we have to convert our files is pretty poor. But I'm going to tell you how to do it if you're interested, because as I struggled with it, I now want to share it so that it's much more easier for you. The first thing you will need to do is to rename the Gradle files. We'll now see how they are need to call, so that Gradle identifies that that's Kotlin and not Groovy. Then write a config file. If you have used Kotlin, Gradle extensively, you will probably have several modules, and in the root module or another file, you probably are adding some things to the ext, which is the extension. You can set a variable to the ext in the root Gradle, for instance, and use it in the application Gradle without any issues. There's something similar in Kotlin, but it's much more difficult to use. You have to create a variable and add the value, and then recover the variable on the other side, so that doesn't scale up very well. So I had to use something different, and I'll show you how it is done. And finally, you will need to convert and compile all the files little by little. I basically use the terminal and doing Gradle assemble debug with the info flag, so that it will show me all the details of what was failing in the files, because otherwise it was almost impossible to do. So the first step is really simple. You have to go from build Gradle to build Gradle KTS, and then regarding the configuration file, what I did was to use the build source. That if you don't do complex things with Gradle, probably you don't know about it, but it's a folder when we can write classes that then Gradle will use during the compilation time. And this just needs to have 2 files, one called build Gradle KTS that only contains this. It's telling that it's going to use the Kotlin DSL plugin, and then a project configuration file, which would be something like this. Obviously, this is a regular Kotlin class, so you can do whatever you want here, but I split it into different sections based on an article I found from Arturo Gutierrez that explained it quite well, but I based on it but changed some things. And this basically has a section with the build plugins, another one with the Android configuration, another one with the libraries, and another with the test libraries, basically. And focusing on one of them, as you see, this is a regular class that has nothing special, just with some final values that then we can use in our Gradle files. And how we use it? Well, going to the build Gradle the root build Gradle of the project, we could add the dependencies of the plugins this way. As you can see, I define a variable with the project configuration, and then use this config file, this config class to define the dependencies. And in the application one, it will be a little more complex because we usually have the dependencies here and all that, but anyway, you see that taking the values from this file is really easy. One thing I mentioned before, that you need to know how the plugin is implemented, is because of this. If you see here, some of the values are properties and some of them are functions, and we have no way to know how they are implemented unless we know about the plugin, or when it starts, the autocomplete starts working, then it can be helpful too. But this is a problem that things that in Groovy were the same, you simply assign using an equals, here in Kotlin are different depending on how they are implemented under the hood. Gradle basically has said that this is a problem in how the plugins are implemented, so I guess we'll just have to wait until the plugins are updated. So my opinion regarding this, that obviously is only my opinion, and we can talk about it later as much as you want, is that this is not very well prepared to use it in production projects. In fact, we have not reached the 1.0 version yet. They are planning it for the first quarter of 2018, so we are close. But it has many issues, and it's a bit unpredictable. For instance, I know there's people that is downloading the project, this project I mentioned before, and they are having problems executing it because where errors arise, and also the conversion is not easy, and the IDE sometimes stops showing everything, starts showing everything like it's not working, everything red, and then it comes back and refreshes everything. It's like a little poor experience. And I have the impression that it's more in the IDE side than in the Gradle side itself. But well, for small pet projects and things like that, as Fernando mentioned, we all have a lot we have a lot of pet projects in our free time. I think it's a good thing to start trying and playing with it, because I'm not sure it is going to be the future, but it's probably something that we have to take in mind, that this change may happen in the future. And if you want to know more about it, I wrote about all this in these articles, about all my experience converting the files, so you can go there and take a look a little more. As you said, in /events is everything, all the links are there, so you don't need to copy anything now. And then for Kotlin for views. As you know, we usually write views in Android by using XMLs, and this can be a little bit tedious from time to time, because we don't have the same power than we get when we are using things from real code. So one of the alternatives that has appeared, well, it really has some time already, it's Anko. Anko is a library written by Kotlin, by the Kotlin team, that is focused to help Android developers have a better experience with the language. Take the most of Kotlin to improve Android development. And in particular, it has a feature called Anko layout, which helps creating views from code instead of doing it from XML. This is a simple example when we are creating a form, a login form, which has a vertical layout with a couple of edit tests. Here we are assigning them to variables and setting the hint, and then a button with the login string, and here we are setting the on-click listener. And as you see, this is showing in Atos the user and the password. This could obviously in real world will potentially call to another layer or do a request to the server to check if the login is correct. But you see that for a simple example, we can get something quite good in little amount of time and code. The result of this would be something like this. We can then, of course, add all types of paddings or layout params, all that. That's all included in the library. The pros of this is that first, it's supposed to be, according to some articles I read, because I didn't do the measures myself, it's like 4 times faster, and this is because when we are inflating a layout in Android, there's an impact because it's not exactly code what we have in the APK, so we have to do some conversions. And when using Anko, we basically have we are creating the objects ourselves, so that's much faster than having to create it from the XMLs. Then that we have better composability, and the reason behind this is that we are using real code and no XML, so we can do whatever we want there. We can extract classes, we can refactor easier, we can rename. All that is much easier than doing it from an XML, obviously. And of course, we have easier data binding or complex calculations because we are inside the code, so we can do whatever we want there. We can set a dimension based on the addition of two other dimensions. It's much more flexible, obviously. But it also has some cons. The most important for me is the lack of designer. We obviously lose the ability to use the designer, but we also don't have a good viewer. There's a plugin that shows a preview of what we are doing, but I tried to use it like 4 or 5 times and none of them work because of different things. I went to the Anko repository, and for some reason or another there were issues created that this wasn't working. So it's not very reliable for a production app that obviously needs to have something consistent and working all the time. And then you have to learn again from scratch. That probably is more an excuse than a con, because we need to be open to learn new stuff. But it's true that if you've been using XMLs for a long time, you're probably very fast and very productive with them, and learning a new thing from scratch can be a little painful. So it's another thing to consider. And the other thing is that even when we are using code, some things are still more complex. For instance, applying styles is not very straightforward. We cannot use styles written in XML. And some other things like layout params, we'll see an example now, are a bit different and a bit difficult to understand from the beginning. And that's a simple example. This is a part of the app I mentioned before too, which has an auto-fit recycler view, which is a custom view that creates a number of columns based on the width of the columns. So it's a custom view. It's not using one in the framework. Then it's applying a style here and then the layout params below. Going step by step, the first thing is this auto-fit recycler class. When we are using classes from the framework or from the different support libraries, we already have those functions written for us, but if we create custom views, we have to create a couple of functions that are a bit weird at the beginning. It's all very well documented in the Anko repository, but you need to know that for any new custom classes, you need to add a couple of extra functions to make it work better. And the second part would be the style apply. Here we have several options. The first one would be creating that's the one I'm using. This is not documented anywhere, but I found it easier to do it that way, to create a function that applies the style. Instead of having the style in our XMLs, we would need to have some functions that do the same work. Here, for instance, is doing the clip to padding a false, column width, scroll by style, all that is added here. And we can apply it using we can apply it using the apply function, which is another standard function in the Kotlin standard library. And another way, which is the one that Anko provides, is a new function called apply recursively that goes through all the tree of the views, and then we can do some pattern matching or however we want to do to decide, depending on the type or the ID or whatever, to what we need to apply to that view. And the last one will be the layout params. If layout params are all wrap content, this is the default, so we wouldn't have to add layout params. But in this case, that is both need to be match parent. You need to use the layout params function, and then here you can set the values or the extra values of those layout params. In this case, as it was inside a coordinator layout, if you know about the design support library, you will need to know that probably you need a behavior to detect the scroll movement and all that. So what's my opinion about this? Here I'm half minded. I know there are some good reasons to use it, but I also find some important drawbacks. I think the most important one is the not having a preview where you can see what you are designing. But this depends a lot. There are people that are very happy with it, that they are using in real projects, in production projects, and I also know of people that are having trouble using it, so it's up to you. The best thing is to try it and decide by yourselves. I personally wouldn't use it because I'm very used to XMLs, and I think that I lose part of my productivity if using them, but I think this is quite personal. And also, if you want to learn a little more about it, I wrote another article about all that, so you can go there and take a look. And last part, Kotlin everywhere. I don't know if you are up to date to the news regarding Kotlin, but in Kotlin 1.2, which is already in release candidate, we have what is called multiplatform projects that will allow us to share project with share code between different Kotlin applications. For instance, we could have a common project that all our applications will share. We could then have our Android app written in Kotlin also. But then, if you know, there are other like other branches of the Kotlin project. One of them is Kotlin JS that allow us to create webs using Kotlin. It's like a special TypeScript, and we could also have shared code between Android and our web application. But of course, we could have our server written in Kotlin, and all the common code could be shared also. So if you have the same domain in the server and in the application, which is usually the case, you could share all those code between both applications. And also, I don't know if there are any iOS developers here, but thanks to Kotlin native, we could even in the future, this is a very experimental feature of Kotlin, but in the future we could even share code with iOS apps, and in general with any app that can run Kotlin native code. The only requisite it needs to have is that the device is supported by the Kotlin native project. They are trying to target the most interesting platforms so that we can run Kotlin everywhere in the future. This is, as I mentioned, this is very experimental. Even the multi-platform projects, which will be released in 1.2, are experimental too. So this is going to change probably quite some in the future. So I'm not even doing a verdict here because the answer is no. Don't use it in your production projects. And how does it work? In our common module, we have classes defined like this with the reserved word expect. That this means that the common module is expecting a class like with this structure written in our project modules. And in all our project products, we have to create an actual class that will have the code it needs to run. This is the way to communicate between the different modules. And that's mostly all about it. I just presented this, but I didn't dive deep into this. So if you ask me tricky questions about it, I probably won't be able to answer. But if you want to see a real example, you can go to the Kotlin Conf app, which was created for the Kotlin Conf that was done like 2 weeks ago. And you can go there and see an example which has exactly the modules I mentioned. It has the common module, and then the web, the Android app, the iOS app are written in Kotlin. Of course, still there are parts that need to be native code. In the case of iOS, written in Swift or in Objective-C. But it gives us much more flexibility to share code between our projects. So that's all I wanted to tell you, how to use Kotlin basically everywhere, first inside Android, and potentially in the future we could be able to use Kotlin in our whole company. Our whole company could be written basically in Kotlin, apart from the part most close to the framework and the UI. And as I mentioned, if you want to take the course of the book, it's a little bit cheaper, and I have to present one of the hidden gems of this DevFest. But first, I want you to ask questions, because otherwise you will be thinking another thing. So if you have some questions, please let me know, and let's see before.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks.